Women, a being to come home to, and women, man's best friend.
Catherine Beecher, an education reformer and the oldest child of the famous minister Lyman Beecher and sister of Harriet Beecher Stowe, wrote an essay on slavery and abolitionism, in reference to the duty of American females in response to speaking tour of two abolitionist sisters, Angelina and Sarah Grimke, who were Southerners from a slaveholding family. The Grimkes had shocked people with their advocacy of immediate abolition by lecturing in public before audiences of mixed genders. They recommended that both men and women became actively and publicly involved with reform.
The following is an excerpt from her essay. It is the grand feature of the divine economy that there should be different stations of superiority and subordination, and it is impossible to annihilate this beneficent and immutable law. In this arrangement of the duties of life, heaven has appointed to one sex the superior and to the other the subordinate station, and this without any reference to the character or conduct of either. It is therefore as much for the dignity as it is for the interest of females in all respects to conform to the duties of this relation, and it is as much a duty as it is for the child to fulfill similar relations to parents or subjects to rulers. But while woman holds a subordinate relation in society to the other sex, it is not because it was designed that her duties or her influence should be any the less important or all-pervading, but it was designed that the mode of gaining influence and of exercising power should be altogether different and peculiar. Woman is to win everything by peace and love, by making herself so much respected, esteemed, and loved that to yield to her opinions and to gratify her wishes will be the free will offering of the heart. But this is to be all accomplished in the domestic and social circle. Then the fathers, the husbands, and the sons will find an influence thrown around them to which they will yield not only willingly but proudly. But the moment woman begins to feel the promptings of ambition or the thirst for power, her aegis of defense is gone.
It wasn't just men who bought into the cult of domesticity. The idea of true equality between men and women was so radical that almost no one embraced it. Despite the economic growth within Americans, women's opportunities for work were very limited. Only very low-paying jobs were available to them, and in most states, they couldn't control their own wages if they were married. But still, poor women found work as domestic servants or seamstresses. The truth is, most American women had no chance to work for profit outside of their homes. So many women found work outside of traditional spheres and reform movements.
Reform movements were open to women partly because if women were supposed to be the moral center of the home, they could also claim to be the moral conscience of the nation. Therefore, it did not seem out of the ordinary for women to become active in the movement to build asylums for the mentally ill, for instance, when Dorothea Dix took the lead in sobering the men of America. Many of the most famous advocates for legally prohibiting the sale of alcohol in the U.S. were women. Frances Willard, an American educator, temperance reformer, and women's suffragist, founded the Women's Christian Temperance Union in 1874, which would be one of the most powerful lobbying groups in the United States by the end of the 19th century. Many women gave temperance lectures featuring horror stories of men who found solace from the harsh competition of the market economy at the bottom of a beer glass. Prohibition was a mistake, infringing on people's freedom and later becoming the only amendment to be repealed. But it is worth remembering that back then, people drank way more than we do now, and that alcohol is probably a greater public health issue than some recreational drugs that remain illegal. Regardless, the temperance movement made a huge difference in American life because eventually, male and female supporters of temperance realized that women would be a more powerful ally against alcohol if they could vote. In 1928, Gilbert Seldes wrote that if prohibition had existed in the 1800s, the suffragists might have remained for another century a scattered group of intellectual cranks. The most urgent reasons for women to want to vote in the mid-1800s was alcohol-related. They wanted saloons closed or at least regulated. They wanted the right to own property and to shield their family's financial security from the profligacy of their drunken husbands. They wanted the right to divorce those men and to have them arrested for wife-beating and to protect children from being terrorized by them.
To do all these things, they needed to change the laws that consigned married women to the status of cattle, and to change those laws, they needed to vote. Many women were also important contributors to the anti-slavery movement, including Sojourner Truth. Abolitionist, teachers, and women's activist Maria Stewart was the first Black woman to lecture mixed male and female audiences. Harriet Beecher Stowe, who wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, an anti-slavery novel, the novel humanized slaves and had profound effect on the attitudes toward African Americans and slavery in the U.S. This is to have said to help delay the groundwork for the American Civil War. Sarah and Angelina Grimke, daughters of a South Carolina slave master, converted to Quakerism and became outspoken critics of slavery. Sarah Grimke published The Letters on the Equality of the Sexes in 1838, the first document to link slavery to the unequal treatment of women.
Many women involved in the abolitionist movement, while studying slavery, noticed similarities to their own experiences. Some male abolitionists, notably Frederick Douglass and William Lloyd Garrison, became supporters of female rights, but ultimately the male leaders of the anti-slavery movement denied women's demands for equality, believing that any calls for women's rights would undermine the cause of abolition. And they may have had a point, because slavery only existed in parts of the world, whereas women existed in all of it. For instance, one of the arguments used by pro-slavery forces was that equality under the law for male slaves might lead to a slippery slope ending with equality for women. Subsequently, out of this emerging consciousness of their own subordinate position, the movement for women's rights was born, leading to the issue of women's suffrage, raised most eloquently at the Seneca Falls Convention of 1848, where Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, and Susan B. Anthony, and many others wrote and published the Declaration of Sentiments modeled very closely on the Declaration of Independence. Except, in some ways, this declaration was much more radical than the original Declaration of Independence because it took on the entire patriarchal structure. One important aspect of the women's rights movement is to remember that for the most part, like other reform movements, the women's rights movement was primarily a middle-class or even upper-class effort. Most of the delegates at Seneca Falls, for instance, were from the middle class. There were no representatives of the working class, but this didn't mean that 19th century feminists didn't acknowledge the needs of working women. Like when Sojourner Truth spoke of the plight of working-class women, especially slaves, since she'd been one until 1827. The last thing to take away from the women's rights movement of the 19th century is that it was difficult and it faced major resistance. The patriarchy is strong. Many women's advocates were fighting to overturn not only laws, but also attitudes. It is interesting to note that the United States ended slavery more than 50 years before it granted women the right to vote. And that although much of the march towards equality between the sexes has been slow and steady, the Equal Rights Amendment, despite being passed by Congress, was never ratified. But by taking leading roles in the reform movements of the 19th century, not just when it came to temperance and slavery, but also prisons and asylums, women were able to enter the public and political sphere for the first time. And these great women changed the world for better and for worse, just as great men do. And in doing so, American women chipped away at the idea that a woman's place must be in the home.